Welcome to the digital class on Prophet Habakkuk. Today we are going to learn about one man who is trying to live with God in this world. Sometimes our experience of things do not match a God who is strong, wise, compassionate. Habakkuk is caught in this same circle where he is refusing to let go. On one hand, evil is endless and boundless, and yet the human spirit refuses to remain silent and dares to complain against God, not in anger but in desperate prayer. When the silence of God is intolerable, the prophet stands at the watchtower waiting for God to respond. Now let us move on to the presentation on Prophet Habakkuk.
Prophet Habakkuk. The name of the book is the prophet himself. The historic scenario during those times was that the Chaldeans had replaced the Assyrians as masters of ancient Near East at the center of Babylon in the late 6th 7th century BC. The prophecies began after the Assyrian decline and fall of Jerusalem in 587 BC. The woes are mentioned in chapter 2, verse 6 to 20, whereas chapter 3 is a canticle. The author has purposely ignored the historical setting of time and given priority to the theological message, that is, the power of God over human history and the call to trust and faithfulness. To highlight prophetic message, the sum of Israel's reflection on nature of its God. The prophet raises doubts about divine justice and God's treatment of the wicked to deal with breakdown of order and justice to which God is silent and inactive. But despite doubts, he has an attitude of faith and trust. In chapter 3, the canticle, he gives an affirmation of God's absolute power over creation and trust. The book condemns all forms of oppression and exploitation, pride and arrogance that stand opposed to humble faith demanded by God. Chapter 1 is mainly the dialogue between the prophet and God. The prophet takes the initiative and questions God about the evil and suffering he sees in the world around him. Is the prophet referring to wicked in the Jewish community or foreign nations as Assyrians or Egyptians? He has tried to emphasize the power of God over human history. There is a theological pattern of redemptive history. Will God indeed, can God remain faithful to the promise and deal graciously with Israel, even in the face of overwhelming power and arrogance of great empires? The response of God, which describes an imminent catastrophe, implies that God already knows, despite the collapse and chaos of the international order, and is added to the call in faith and trust of the prophet. The first exchange is seen in chapter 1, verse 2 to 11, where the prophet cries out to God and receives a divine response assuring help. The prophet complains that there is no justice. He refers to the basic violation of human rights, which categorizes the confusion and anarchy of those times. Whether the holy and pure God can bear to see this and not help restore justice and order for Israel, that the people are not relying on the divine revelation but only using their strength and will. Example of how the city wall was broken in Jerusalem with the engine of war, how the attitude was used to divinize their own strength and will. He talks about the people's arrogance and their excessive pride, to which the Lord responds that the rise of the Chaldeans does not signify their stability, but fear and suffering. He mentions that the conquering with violence and destruction was for the wicked people living there, and God affirms that the new masters will impose justice according to the standards. In the second exchange, which is seen in chapter 1, verse 12 to chapter 2, verse 5, the prophet complains and provides a chilling description of the barbarity and ruthlessness of the Chaldeans. He focuses on Yahweh's immortality than Israel. He highlights that cruel and powerful people are an instrument of Yahweh's design for the wicked. He, however, is troubled on the intolerance to stop the injustice that contradicts the essence of God. Reading from verse 15 to 17. The enemy brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out of his net. He gathers them in his seine. So he rejoices and exults. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his seine. For by them his portion is lavish and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and destroying nations without mercy? For the enemy or the conquerors, the prophet explains that human life has no value more than mute creatures at sea. To this, the Lord's response comes forth in chapter 2, verse 1 to 5, where he emphasizes that the significance of the call is for faithfulness and trust. The Lord mentions to the prophet to not get carried away in their ability to gather power and riches. He hints at the wicked's pride and greed to the prophet. The five woes are seen in chapter 2, verse 6 to 20. A woe is a song of grief over death or loss, or express great joy over the fate of the enemy. The prophet describes the people of Babylon who have been oppressed and treated so cruelly with their greed and arrogance. The prophet reveals that God, as one judge, and condemns not single empire but every form of oppression. The woes express celebration of downfall and shame of the oppressed. The first woe, the arrogance, is seen in chapter 2, verse 6b, where the oppressors are treated the inhabitants as tenants and debtors to the land. Thus they had to surrender security and pledges in return of the property usage, and now the loans are demanded. The second woe is presumption, which is seen in chapter 2, 9 to 10, which ensures safety and impregnability of their house. However, the nature itself has rebelled against them. The third woe is vainglory and violence, which is seen in chapter 2, verse 12, where building of a city on bloodshed and the people cause divine legitimation for temple construction to justify any violence taking place. The fourth woe is the degradation of human dignity, which is seen in chapter 2, verse 15. The violence of conquerors to bring shame and exploitation to the people. The people will be paid in kind, and God's wrath will cause them to reel. The fifth woe is idolatry. The pretension of idol worshippers is to ignore Yahweh. Idolatry goes hand in hand with injustice. People can use idols to justify the conduct of their devotees, sanctifying violations of human rights and dignity. The Canticle of Habakkuk, which is the hymn, is seen in chapter 3, verse 1 to 19. It is a poem to celebrate Yahweh's lordship in history and creation. It portrays a visionary experience and the prophet's role as an intercessor. It is linked structurally and thematically to God's answers to the prophet, which is seen in chapter 1 and 2, expressing his confidence in God's rule. The song is used to worship God, especially chapter 3, verse 12. The prophet's fear and confusion for divine appearance, yet he trusts in God's coming as an occasion of salvation and victory for his people. The larger mythical pattern in which the battle between the storm god and the sea is explained as God's appearance and reaction of creation, signifying the battle between the warrior and Yahweh and the power of chaos. The triumph focuses on Yahweh's victory on behalf of his people of Israel. This is seen in chapter 3, verse 8 to 15, where there is a preparation of the battle with victorious chariot shows the outcome of the struggle is foreshadowed. The other one is the reaction of the nature, with the universe, earth, and heavens panic at the approach of the divine warrior. The charge in battle is where Yahweh is using lightning as his weapon, and the victory is the final moment of triumph as God's foes lie prostrate under his feet. The prophet displays his own fear to God's awesome majesty and power. The turmoil in the nature means collapse plans for God's approach. The canticle ends with confidence and trust in Yahweh, where the prophet by steadfast fidelity will live. Reflection. Does the prophet Habakkuk speak to us today? In our lives, as well, we confront many horrors, and by some we are disturbed. Our experiences show us how little we are and how helpless we are against the forces that destroy our hopes. This requires strong faith to see the hand of God in these events, to recognize that every creature comes from God, who is Yahweh, the God of Israel, and the Father of Jesus Christ. It is easy to speak about the will of God. However, it is not easy. Everything that happens is not right. But He is watching, and behind all of it, there is a purpose of His majestic power. We today also sometimes fall in question, but what we see in faith is that we have been called to be faithful and to trust God. And with that, we will receive answers of peace and love from God Himself. Thank you very much for listening to the book of Prophet Habakkuk. We will see you next class. Hope you all enjoyed the session today.